So today I'm joined by Bret Kugelmass, Managing Director of Energy Impact Center. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
All right, so let's get right into it. The Energy Impact Center analyzes and supports the solution set for tools which are able to reverse climate change in the next 20 years or so. So why the focus on nuclear energy out of all the variable renewable energy mix?
So note that our organization's mission is to reverse climate change. And I think this is what gets lost on most people pretty often, what it means to actually reverse climate change. It is not enough to just take on emissions that we put into the air every year, right? We've already put 1,000 gigatons of CO2 into the air over the last 100 years, which means that even if we got to net zero emissions across every sector, industry, agriculture, electricity, transportation, building heat, I mean, you name it. If we got to zero carbon worldwide, globally, in every sector, that would make a negligible difference in terms of climate change because of the CO2 that we've already emitted. So when we talk about reversing climate change, what we mean is that you have to actually not only eliminate all of our ongoing emissions, but take care of all the previous emissions as well. And the only power source, the only energy source that's powerful enough to account for that is nuclear energy. And that's just according to the laws of physics. I mean, the energy stored within the atom is 6 orders of magnitude greater than chemical energy. So from a math perspective, it's a no-brainer. Yes, there's these, obviously, whether it be public perception issues that we can talk about in detail today, but according to math, nuclear is the only way to go.
So it's hard enough to change the public narrative to net zero, and you're talking about going even further to essentially negative decarbonization.
Yeah.
Again, there's a lot of things at play, and then of course when you introduce nuclear energy, that also has its own set of kind of baggage and perception issues. So how do you actually move this thing forward?
Well, listen, I think it's hard to gain public support for anything when nobody's putting forth a viable solution. I mean, you've got two sides arguing with each other. One side is saying, oh, this isn't a big deal, or it doesn't even exist. The other side is saying this is the worst thing that could possibly ever happen, but they're not actually putting forth a solution. They're putting forth a lot of things they like that might be working in the right direction. People like renewables, people like efficiency, people like electric cars. They've got great branding. So people want to advocate for these things. But there's this underlying sense that that's not even enough. And both sides know that. And so that's why you just get this arguing back and forth with nothing actually happening, because nobody's putting forth a solution to actually address the problem. You will not fix climate change until you remove the 1,000 gigatons of CO2 that we've already put in the air.
Yeah. So on the solution, I just want to make sure, because in order to have a robust discussion or debate and to be able to actually talk about solution, it means that either parties have to be able to actually be educated and aware enough, because I just want to be clear, it's not that solutions don't exist. The technical solutions and the blueprints do exist. It's just a matter of whether the policymakers or the talking heads have actually educated themselves to even talk about it properly.
Yeah, I do think the policymakers being educated is very important, but we don't need everyone to be educated. I mean, listen, it sounds nice to say everyone should be educated, right? Like I feel good when I say that, right? But that doesn't mean that it's true. We don't need everyone to be educated to solve world problems. We didn't when it came to curing the ozone layer. Most people in the world still have no idea what the ozone layer is. We fixed that problem. Even most educated people never really got involved. We do not have to educate the public to solve this problem, even though it sounds nice to say that.
Well, I understand the perspective you're coming from, but at the same time, part of the perception issue is because of the lack of understanding that the safety mechanism, the operational means, the capex and the opex of these new generation of nuclear energies is very different from the legacy that the public media tends to focus on.
I would argue that the only problem with nuclear energy is economics, and everything else that we talk about, whether it's public concern, policy, you name it, that's all just a cover because the nuclear industry has never gotten the economics question correct. Nuclear energy used to be much, much cheaper. The 1970s designs, I mean, they're running today at $30 a megawatt hour, consistent day and night, which is competitive with anything out there. So we knew kind of how to build cheap nuclear back then in the 1970s, and then we've only lost that as we moved forward in time. So what I advocate for usually is kind of going back to the drawing board. Hey, what made them cheap in the 1970s, and how can we apply modern technology to make it even cheaper from that? If you solve the economics equation, all of these other things that people talk about, public perception, policy, regulation, all these things will go away if you solve the economics.
Yeah, I really agree with what you're saying. Absolutely. It comes down to the bottom line. So tell me, explain to me, what was the design back in the 70s that made the CapEx and OpEx lower, and how is that currently being applied? Because again, I think the approach to generation 3 and 4 are different. They have kind of built-in safe mechanism. They're cheaper to build out, maintain, and in some ways doesn't even need active intervention. So how do we strip out the cost structure?
Well, we got to look at where the costs come from. First, in case your audience doesn't know what we're talking about when we talk about generations, generation 2 of nuclear power plants was essentially what they built in the 1970s. It's what's all around the world today. There's over 400 of these plants chugging along, providing 10% of the world's energy, 10% of the world's electricity, 4% of the world's energy. In the US, it's 20% of our electricity here. That's the generation 2. That's the existing plants in the 1970s. Those things are amazing. A lot of people like to disparage them, whether to advocate for newer technologies or whether to just make their other technology in a different sector seem better in some way. But the generation 2 nuclear power plants that you've got running right now across the country are amazing. Generation 3 is supposed to be that with all these extra things on top of it, just to make it, it's like you got a Rolex already, you want to put some extra diamonds on that Rolex. That's what generation 3 is. And then generation 4 are supposed to be a complete overhaul, new designs, new chemistry, new materials, new reactor physics. So this is what we're talking about when we say generation 2, 3, and 4. What worked with generation 2? Generation 2, it was just simpler. There was less regulatory requirements. They built them faster. The construction management at the time was better because they were building so many of them. There was a lot of experience out there, a lot of construction experience. And so they just came together quicker. Now, here's what's crazy. The generation 2 were built in a period of the highest interest rates our country has ever seen, like 1970s to the 1980s. If you literally just built those in today's interest rates, the exact same blueprints using modern construction technology, the exact same ones, generation 2, they'd be half price, if not cheaper. And so that's why I'm advocating that we should start there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And can you tell us about some of the data that you're referencing, and where can people actually find some of this calculation to support your claim?
Well, if you're looking for construction economics data on nuclear, I mean, there's a wealth of it online. You could start with Wikipedia. There's a ton of it publicly available. The government has published a ton. The Department of Energy in the 1980s actually put together this incredible report, which you can pull a tremendous amount of data from, called the EEDB report. What they did was they hired an engineering firm to go through and detail out literally all the construction costs in nuclear power. And that's all publicly available. So if you go there, you can see, I mean, it's literally a blueprint for how cheap nuclear energy can be. It's pretty amazing.
So that brings up to my next question, which is one of the things that your organization does is to really make not only information available, but also data available, as well as expertise. And one of the ways you do that is through a podcast, Titans of Nuclear, which is central to EIC's reach and influence. How are you using the podcast to further the agenda for nuclear energy?
Yeah, so the podcast started off as essentially just a learning platform for our organization. There's an incredible wealth of information online that you can find by just researching and collecting data and building your own models. But then there's a lot of stuff that you really need to meet with experts to understand the fine nuances of. And so we started meeting with experts around the world. We've met with over 1,200 experts in the last couple of years. We've published over 175 podcasts detailing over hour-long conversations with each one of them, asking those questions, asking the fine points that maybe you can't discern in the literature. So this has been just a base of information for us to, be able to advocate for how we think you can solve the economics equation in nuclear, which we think is vital to solving the climate change problem overall. But then we're also taking an entire community along with us on this journey. Our community is composed of engineers, entrepreneurs, financiers, and by bringing these people up to speed with all this extra educational material that we're collecting, we want to kick off a revolution in new nuclear power development and deployment around the world.
I love it. It sounds like a really grassroots oriented approach that takes into account the multi-stakeholders and the people that needs to be involved on all sides of the facet. Let's talk about some of your other tools as well. You have a 4D drought model and mass migration, and that factors into account precipitation, population, infrastructure, and agriculture as well. And it's really around looking at the function of drought risk. Who's using it? How are they using it? What is the purpose of this?
Yeah, so we think there's a few things that are missing in the climate narrative. The one we talked about before, which is that even if you zero out all emissions, that doesn't solve the problem. It probably makes even a negative or negligible difference. The other thing that we think people aren't considering, and that doesn't make its way into the climate narrative, is just how quickly we need to do this and why. Yes, we can tie with great amount of certainty temperature rise to flooding risk, right? And we can show how over the course of another 100 years of heat accumulation, how much ice is going to melt and how much the sea levels will rise. Okay, that's fine. But that puts the problem out to 2100, and that's the least of our worries. Yes, it'll mean we have to rebuild entire cities on the coastline, but I'm telling you that is the least of our worries. What is the most important thing that we should be considering is drought risk. And that's why we're putting together this model where what we want to show is, as we've seen in Syria, as we've seen in Central America, if you have just a few years in a row of precipitation variability, so that's what I say when I say drought, I mean precipitation variability, really. What happens, unfortunately, is that the existing agricultural infrastructure that you have in place no longer works, which means if you're a poor farmer, you have to move, right? Your choice is move or die. And so they move, and then you've got populations moving into places that maybe people don't want them or that maybe cause civil conflict. And that, right, once again, that's what we saw in Syria. That's what we've seen in Central America. A lot of the pressure on the US southern border right now is coming from climate. It's coming from climate change. And this is just going to keep on expounding year over year. We're going to see more variability in precipitation, more populations have to move. And so the research that we're collecting on that front is to visualize this in order to make it more real to people. Hey, here's the real short-term risk is displacement induced by precipitation variability.
Yeah, I recently interviewed Francesco Femia, who is the CEO of the Council of Strategic Risk and also the co-founder for Center for Climate and Security. And you're right. What we're talking about is food security as well as national security. And when there is essentially finite constrained set of resources, agriculture, food supply, you're going to have a rise in violence, faction, as well as mass migration, movements of people, which creates that tension between sovereignties and borders like we're seeing today, which is only going to get further exacerbated.
Yes.
So, Bret, talk to me about what is a singular message you want to give out to the listeners around nuclear energy? How should they frame it? Where should they look for information? And how can they convey it easily in digestible form to others?
Well, we tried to put together the most comprehensive source of nuclear knowledge that's ever existed on the web, right? That's the Titans of Nuclear podcast, and you can find it at titansofnuclear.com. So that's our effort. If you want to find it in more concise format, I give a bunch of lectures as well. I tour the U.S. university scene, giving lectures specifically on climate change and nuclear energy. And these range anywhere from 6-minute YouTube clips to hour-long YouTube videos. So you can just go on YouTube, type in my name, Bret Kugelmass lecture, and you can find information there as well. We try to make the media as engaging as possible. That's why we focus on audio and video and not so much policy papers, which can get a little bit dry to your average audience. So that's what we're doing to try to put all this information out there. What I would really want people to take away from this conversation, if there's one point I want to drive home more than anything, is that the damage that we've already done to our atmosphere, which is going to induce climate changes, right, from warming, that was essentially us burning oil, right, burning fossil fuels, burning coal, which it took the planet 100 million years to accumulate. And we've burned about half of it in the last 20 or 30 years, okay? And so we can't count on natural processes to just fix this for us. And the damage is already done. So us just reducing the rate at which we accumulate damage is not going to be enough. And nuclear energy, according to the laws of physics, is 6 orders of magnitude more powerful than fossil fuels. This is why we need to employ this incredible technology to solve the problem.
So let me do this, Bret. I want to invite you back maybe in a couple of months, because right now, at the time of this recording, we're having presidential candidate primary debates among the Democrats, for example. And I don't believe that nuclear energy specifically is being called out. So when I invite you back, let's talk about a blueprint, something short, something simplified, that in 15, 20 minutes, you can explain how could we feasibly address the economic issue and be able to actually forge ahead and actually start to reverse the carbonization that we've created for ourselves.
Sounds good.
So today I've been joined by Bret Kugelmass, who is the Managing Director at Energy Impact Center. Bret, thank you so much for today.
Thank you, Scott.